Okay, welcome to Unit 4 on transport. And we cannot start this unit any other way than talking about your blood. So that is what Concept 1 notes is going to be all about is blood. So what is your blood? Just a little review. Blood is a fluid connective tissue, which we talked about in Unit 1 when we did our intro to histology in Concept 3. And it's made of living blood cells, which are often referred to as the formed elements. And those cells float in a non living blood plasma. So that's kind of a summary of the composition of blood. And its main function is transport, which is why we have to start off talking about it. It moves so many different substances to all the different parts of your body. And because of this, we are able to maintain homeostasis by regulating and protecting, really. We're moving hormones, we're moving oxygen, we're moving waste like carbon dioxide, we're moving nutrients and ions, we're moving all the things. So it's incredibly important. And it is the one component of the body second to your brain that scientists haven't figured out how to reproduce or imitate yet. And this is why donating blood is of great importance. Every 2 seconds, someone in the United States needs a blood transfusion. And this isn't something that scientists can just synthesize in lab for them. They have to have donated blood. So that's really important. And a fun fact about your blood, 8% of your actual body weight is your blood, which I think is kind of interesting too. All right, let's talk about the functions of blood. We said the main function is transport, but it does a variety of things within that, and then some other things too. So one of the main things that your blood transports is oxygen from your lungs and the nutrients from your from your digestive tract, then to the rest of your body. Also, your blood removes waste from your cells like CO2 and transporting hormones from the endocrine structures to your target organs, which is something we talked about in Unit 3, Control and Coordination. Also, your blood is really important for regulation. Regulating your body temperature. Your body temperature is really regulated by your blood and its ability to absorb and then distribute heat throughout your body. The pH of your blood, it acts as a buffer for a lot of biochemical things. Your fluid volume. Also for protection. We'll talk about your blood a lot in Unit 6 when we talk about protection and your immune system. But it's important for preventing blood loss, which we do via clotting, we'll talk about, and preventing infection by carrying antibodies and white blood cells to infected tissues, which again, we'll get into more detail in Unit 6. So your blood just does so much. It's so incredibly important, and that's why we're spending a whole concept on it. So let's go into that structure more. Whole blood, which is what would come out when you're bleeding, or if you donate blood, we would refer to that as whole blood. It's essentially a mixture of formed elements, which are the different types of blood cells, water, and dissolved molecules. And we can separate the components of blood pretty easily when they get centrifuged, which is basically where we spin them incredibly fast and the elements separate out by density. Because before centrifuging, it looks like a homogeneous liquid, but it actually isn't. It would separate out like this after being centrifuged. 55% of your whole blood is plasma. 90% of that is water, and then 10% is solute, so dissolved molecules. Less than 1% of your whole blood is this buffy coat, so it's kind of this like layer that you would see here. And that's your white blood cells and something called platelets, which we'll talk about. And then 45% of your whole blood are your red blood cells. Blood is sticky and it's opaque, and it is red in color. But that redness does vary based on how much oxygen is in the blood. So sometimes in pictures you see red versus blue blood, and often we think that the blue doesn't have the oxygen in it, but that's not the case. Your blood is never blue. It's always red. If it's oxygen-rich blood, it's a more scarlet color, and if it's oxygen-poor blood, it's actually a darker red. Its pH is between 7.35 and 7.45, So it's just the tiniest bit alkaline, and it's actually more dense and viscous than water, which is, I think, a fun fact because you might have heard that phrase, your blood is thicker than water. Um, and that is actually true. So let's talk about each of these components quickly. So your plasma, this is mainly water, like we said, with dissolved substances such as plasma proteins. So your plasma is a non-living substance, but all these other components of your blood are living. So we have your white blood cells, which are also called leukocytes. They're in purple in this picture. They help our body recognize and fight off foreign substances. And again, we'll talk about them so much in Unit 6. Platelets, which are also known as thrombocytes, we can kind of see them pictured here. These are cell fragments that help stop bleeding when a blood vessel gets damaged, which we'll talk about towards the end of these notes. And then, of course, your red blood cells, which we said are 45% of your whole blood. They're also known as erythrocytes, and they carry oxygen and CO2 between your lungs and the rest of the body. So we'll be talking about these, especially as we get into the cardiovascular and respiratory systems after this. Just for abbreviations of notes, I'll always refer to white blood cells from now on as WBCs, red blood cells as RBCs. And then remember, you can also just refer to this as plasma, and then these are our formed elements. That's kind of a way you can summarize those three things together. And one thing I also meant to mention, dissolved substances. That is things like these plasma proteins, but can also be like ions / electrolytes, hormones, waste products, etc. So those are all types of things that would be dissolved in that plasma. All right, let's talk more about erythrocytes, your red blood cells, because they are incredibly important. When you look at their shape, it has a very distinct shape that most of you are probably familiar with. It's this flattened biconcave shape. And because of this specific shape, it creates a larger surface area on the red blood cell for gas exchange, which is so important for when we get to the respiratory system. And it makes them flexible enough that they can squeeze through tight spaces, which is also important. Mature red blood cells consist of a plasma membrane surrounding tons of proteins, 97% of which is the protein hemoglobin. Mature red blood cells do not have a nucleus or other organelles. So you might be saying, what the heck? How does this even qualify then? Well, red blood cells do start out with a nucleus and DNA when they're first made, but as they mature, they are specializing for gas exchange. And so and to do that, we need hemoglobin, because hemoglobin is able to grab onto oxygen. And so they want as much space as possible inside of them for hemoglobin. And so as they mature, they literally get rid of other things that they don't need so that they have room for that hemoglobin. And again, hemoglobin is a protein. It binds and it carries oxygen. What it has in the center of it, and we could get into more detail on its structure, but I'm not going to, because I just want you to get the big picture here, but it has iron on the inside, and iron readily binds the oxygen. And so that is a really important component of its structure. If you've ever been told or heard of someone being anemic, that means they have low iron, which means they're not able to get as much oxygen. I actually am pregnant right now, and I have I'm slightly anemic during my pregnancy, and which is a big deal if you don't take care of it, because we need lots of oxygen, not only for me, but for the growing baby inside of me. And so I take iron supplements now to make sure I have the iron that I need in my hemoglobin in order to get the oxygen that I need to not only my cells, but also the cells in this growing baby. So how is your blood formed? We actually have talked about this very briefly, if you remember back in Unit 2, Support in Motion. It's in a process called hematopoiesis. That's your blood cell formation. Most of your blood cells, majority, are not dividing cells. So it's not like one red blood cell, if we need more red blood cells, they just go through mitosis and replicate themselves. Your blood cells are made from stem cells in your red bone marrow, which is something we talked about in Unit 2. So that's how we make replacement cells. So your red bone marrow contains stem cells that are hematopoietic, and then those differentiate and specialize into white blood cells, red blood cells, platelets. All right, erythropoietin, EPO, is the hormone that regulates the formation and destruction of red blood cells. And so it is incredibly important, and it's made mostly in your kidneys, but it's also in your liver. So here's a connection to the endocrine system that's really important. And it's triggered, so the formation of it is triggered by a drop in your normal blood oxygen level. So if your body receives this stimulus that your blood oxygen levels are low, it will be triggered to make more EPO, which will regulate making more red blood cells. Every second, millions of blood cells pour out of your red bone marrow, because the average red blood cell is only living like 100 to 120 days. And this is one of the reasons, too, if you ever donate blood, you can only do it every so often, usually every 4 months or so that your body has time to regenerate the blood that is lost. All right, let's talk about blood clotting. So, hemostasis. This is the fast and localized process that your body uses to stop bleeding if that happens. It's a highly regulated process that I'm not going to get into the details of, but I do want you to know the basic steps. So first, you have a vascular spasm, meaning your blood vessels have smooth muscles in them, basically for helping move the blood through them. And those smooth muscles, wherever the blood vessel is damaged, they start to contract. So this yields something called vasoconstriction, and that slows down the blood flow. Think if you had a hose, for instance, and you clench it with your fist, the water is not going to be able to flow through the hose like it could before. So that's what we're doing here. We're trying to slow down the blood flow so we don't bleed out. Then you have platelet plug formation. This is when your platelets, so those are little parts of the formed elements in your blood, they gather and they stick to the site and to each other, and they start forming a plug to block the damage. And then we have coagulation. This is when fibrin proteins in your blood form a mesh-like clot, which we can kind of see here, that closes the gap and then will heal the blood vessel. So that is a very basic summary of how blood clotting works. Now, I'd be remiss if I talked about blood and didn't go through the blood types. This should be something familiar to you from Biology 1. So all of your cells have glycoprotein, okay, and glycolipid markers and tags. Remember, if glyco is the prefix in a word, it just means like a carbohydrate. So glycoproteins are proteins with carbs attached to them. Glycolipids are lipids with carbs attached to them, and they're basically used for signaling. And we call these markers or tags specifically antigens. If your body recognizes cells that have different antigens from it, they are then perceived as foreign, and your body will activate an immune response against it and attack it because it wants to get rid of foreign substances that could be harmful to it. Antibodies respond to antigens by binding to them and then clumping. Agglutinating is the fancy word for it. They agglutinate cells together for destruction. So your body makes antibodies for the antigens it will perceive as foreign, and so the antibodies will attack those foreign antigens and tag them for destruction, essentially. Red blood cell antigens are specifically referred to as agglutinogens because they're basically doing that agglutinating, which I was just talking about, that clumping together. So your blood type is determined based on the presence or absence of A and B agglutinogens. And that's what we're going to kind of organize in a little chart here. So let's say your blood type is AB, which is one of the most rare. You have agglutinogens on your red blood cells for A and B. So you have A and B markers or tags on your cell. That means your body doesn't make anti-A or anti-B antibodies, okay? Because it knows A and B. So if you were going to get a blood transfusion that had A's or B's in it, like your body would recognize that. So it's not going to attack it with antibodies. So that means if you are type AB blood, you can take in any of the other blood types because you have the markers that'll make it possible for your body to recognize them and not see them as foreign. Okay, let's talk about blood type A. Blood type A only has the agglutinogens 4A, meaning it would see B and recognize it as foreign. Thus, your body makes anti-B antibodies. These will attack B antigens. Note they have this square-like shape like the B's here because it would see them as foreign. And so that is why you can only take blood type A and O. Blood type B is the opposite. It only has the markers for B, thus it makes anti-A antibodies. Notice the curvature here, so it would attack those A marker cells. So blood type B, you can only receive B and O. And then last is blood type O. There are no markers on blood type O. So if you have blood type O, you make anti-A and anti-B antibodies. And because of this, you can't receive any of these blood types because you have the antibodies that would attack them. So you can only have blood type O. Now, O we call the universal donor because it has no markers on it, none of these antibodies are going to attack it. So everybody can take O. AB is the universal receiver because it has all of the markers, so it can accept any type of blood. It won't recognize it as foreign. So a blood transfusion is what happens if you basically are running out of blood and you are in an emergency situation and your blood loss is rapid and your blood volume needs to get boosted ASAP. What they'll basically do is they'll have to make sure you're getting the type of blood that matches your blood type. And because blood is super valuable and we're not able to artificially synthesize it, most transfusions are actually just infusions of packed red blood cells. They're not actually whole blood. Like what you actually donate, you're not just going to pump that directly into somebody else. Normally, blood banks will separate your whole blood into different components and then only donate what's needed for a specific patient in a specific situation. So what happens then if you're blood type A and you're in an emergency and they start transfusing blood type B in you? Well, a transfusion reaction will most likely occur. And that's where the blood recipient, so the patient's plasma antibodies would attack the donated red blood cells from the transfusion because type A has anti-B antibodies. And this results in that agglutination or the clumping of foreign red blood cells, which would clog up your blood vessels all throughout the body. And then that could lead to a lot of issues, like the transfused red blood cells obviously won't be able to transport oxygen like we need them to. That was the whole reason we did a transfusion in the first place. So you're going to have that lack of oxygen where we need it. And or it can result in the clogging, causing decreased blood flow to block tissues. And then those clogs can then rupture, or your phagocytes can destroy them, which we'll talk about in the immune system. But this can result in hemoglobin in your bloodstream rather than contained in your red blood cells like it normally is, which then causes your kidneys to shut down, which is something called acute renal failure, which you may have heard of from a medical TV show. They talk about renal failure a lot. And the recipient then could die from the donor's blood. So having the correct blood match is an important thing. And now, there aren't just A and B markers. We also have this rhesus factor or the RH factor. So your red blood cells also have these RH antigens, which make your blood either positive or negative. So you can be A positive, A negative, AB positive, AB negative, that kind of thing. If you are RH positive, you have these rhesus antigens. So you would have an additional marker on here. So you're not going to make anti-RH antibodies, which means you wouldn't attack positive or negative blood because you're not making something that would attack them. If you're Rh negative, you do not have the rhesus antigens, so you will make anti-Rh antibodies, and thus you could only accept negative blood because your body would see the positive as a foreign object. So the A versus B antigens and then these rhesus antigens that make it positive or negative are determined by totally different genes, which hopefully you learned the genetics of it in Biology 1. It's something we could review really quickly if you want. But the point is they sort independently. So if you remember the law of independent assortment. So what that means is there's 8 different blood types, totally unique blood types because they don't if you have an A, that doesn't determine whether you have a plus or minus. Those are different things, which we could totally get into. So those are the 8 different blood types. So the true universal donor is O negative, and then the true universal receptor or receiver of blood would be the AB positive. And so this is something really easy. Anytime you ever have to give blood at the doctor, or if you donate blood, it can be determined. All right, that's our brief overview of blood.